I still remember that night as if it were etched into my skin. The smell of polished marble floors mixed with the faint scent of expensive champagne. The kind of night where the chandeliers seemed to float above everyone's heads, dripping with wealth I could never dream of touching. And there I was, kneeling with a mop in my hands, scrubbing a corner of the gallery floor that nobody even noticed. Nobody except me. It was the annual charity gala in Chicago's most prestigious art gallery. The air was thick with laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the hum of people who had never worked a day with their hands. They didn't see me as a person. I was a shadow in a uniform, invisible by design. But fate has a strange way of yanking shadows into the spotlight. Richard Hall was the center of it all. If Chicago had a crown, he wore it. A real estate tycoon who built towers of glass and steel, but never learned how to smile without arrogance. People hung on his every word because his signature could make or break fortunes. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the mop. Still, I heard his voice echo across the marble floor, booming, self-satisfied. "Art," he said, "is nothing but an investment. You buy low, you sell high. Same rules as real estate." The crowd laughed obediently. I paused, biting my lip, and for a split second, I wished someone would argue with him, but no one dared. Then his eyes found me. It was the kind of stare that strips you bare without touching you. He tilted his glass toward me, and suddenly, the whole room turned in my direction. I froze, still holding the mop. I wanted to sink into the floor. "Well," Richard chuckled, "since we're talking about art, what about her?" His finger pointed straight at me. "Our cleaning staff. Maybe she can tell us what makes a masterpiece." The laughter was sharper this time, cutting through me. My cheeks burned. My instinct was to bow my head, mutter an apology for simply existing, and keep working. That's what I always did. That's how you survived when you were invisible. But he wasn't finished. "Tell you what," Richard said, with that smirk that comes from knowing nobody can touch you. He motioned toward a blank canvas mounted on an easel, waiting for one of the hired artists to demonstrate later. "If you can paint something, anything worth looking at, I'll buy this entire gallery tonight." The room gasped, then erupted into laughter. Some shook their heads, others pulled out their phones, already sensing a spectacle. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I gripped the mop until my knuckles ached. I wanted to say no, to walk away. But then I felt the weight of the small object in my pocket, the old paintbrush I always carried. The last piece of my past life, from when I thought I would be a painter, before sickness and bills crushed that dream. It was foolish, maybe even childish, but I never let it go. And in that moment, with the entire gallery watching, I knew I couldn't stay invisible anymore. I straightened my back. The laughter dimmed, uncertain. Without a word, I set the mop aside, reached into my pocket, and pulled out the worn paintbrush. The bristles were frayed, stained with colors long dried. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I walked toward the blank canvas. My shoes squeaked softly on the marble, every step sounding like a drumbeat. The light seemed harsher, the silence unbearable. Richard leaned back in amusement, swirling his wine, certain I would humiliate myself. But I wasn't thinking about him anymore. I wasn't even thinking about the crowd. All I could see was the empty canvas, like a mirror daring me to prove I still existed. And with my old brush trembling in my hand, I stood before it, ready to show them all. The brush felt strange in my hand, heavier than I remembered, as though it carried the weight of every year I had ignored it. My palms were slick, my chest tight. For a moment, I almost turned away, almost surrendered to the laughter still bubbling in the corners of the room. But then I dipped the brush into the palette left behind by one of the staff artists. The paint was fresh, glistening under the lights. waiting to be used. My hand trembled as I touched bristle to canvas. The first stroke was shaky, almost hesitant, but it broke the silence like thunder. Gasps escaped from the crowd. They weren't expecting me to begin. And neither was I. I drew again, this time firmer. Long vertical lines in muted blues and grays. A city skyline began to emerge. Not the glamorous towers Richard Hall owned, not the postcards people sold to tourists. No, this was my Chicago. The streets after a rainstorm, when neon lights bled into puddles, and the world felt both broken and beautiful. As the strokes came faster, my fear melted away. The noise of the gala disappeared, replaced by the sound of rain only I could hear in my mind. My wrist moved with a rhythm buried deep inside me, one I thought I had lost. Every line carried memory. Nights walking home from the hospital after visiting my mother, shoes soaked, heart heavy, but eyes still catching the shimmer of headlights on wet pavement. I painted those moments, the loneliness, the resilience, the small, stubborn glimmers of hope. The laughter stopped. No clinking glasses, no idle chatter. Just silence. I didn't dare look at them, but I felt their stares. First curious, then unsettled, then something else entirely. And when I stepped back, the canvas revealed itself. Chicago in the rain. Street lamps glowing like halos. Reflections stretching across wet asphalt like fragile rivers of color. A city not polished, not proud, but alive. I lowered the brush, my arm aching. The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard Hall, still holding his glass of wine, leaned forward. The smirk he wore earlier was gone. His eyes locked on the canvas as if it had pulled something out of him he didn't want to remember. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and turned away. I didn't bow, didn't wait for applause or judgment. I simply walked back to where my mop leaned against the wall. My hand shook as I picked it up, pretending to focus again on the floor. For a moment, no one moved. Then whispers began to spread through the gallery, soft and uncertain. "Did you see that? Who is she?" That was incredible. I could feel the heat of their stares burning into my back, but I kept my head down. Richard finally broke the silence. His voice was lower, almost hoarse. "Interesting," he muttered, though I caught it. He didn't sound amused anymore. I dipped the mop back into the bucket, letting the murky water slosh against the tiles. My heart was racing, my breath shallow, but outside I tried to remain invisible again. Because if there's one thing life had taught me, it's that attention can be a dangerous thing. As I scrubbed the floor, I knew nothing would be the same after tonight. I had stepped out of the shadows, and whether I liked it or not, the world had seen me. And Richard Hall, whether he admitted it or not, had seen me too. The morning after the gala, the city felt different. Or maybe it was just me. The streets outside my apartment were the same as always. Cracked sidewalks, buses groaning at every corner, a haze of smoke from food carts mixing with the chill of early dawn. Life moved as it always had, but I carried a weight that hadn't been there the day before. When I walked into the gallery for my shift, something was off. People were looking at me, really looking, not just glancing past me like furniture. Their eyes lingered, sharp with curiosity, their whispers trailing behind me as I pushed my cart down the hall. "Is that her?" someone hissed. "Yeah, the janitor from last night. I heard she painted like a pro. You should have seen Richard's face." The words cut into me, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. They had seen me, and now they couldn't unsee it. I kept my head down, polishing the brass handles of the gallery doors, pretending not to hear. But inside, my chest was burning. For years, I had fought to be invisible, because invisibility meant safety. If no one saw you, no one could hurt you. And now, in a single reckless moment, I had thrown that shield away. By mid-morning, the gossip had spilled out of the gallery walls and into the city. I overheard two delivery men outside chatting about the janitor who put those rich folks to shame. Later, when I grabbed a cup of coffee at the corner shop, even the barista raised an eyebrow. "Hey, aren't you the one?" she started, then trailed off when I shook my head quickly. It didn't matter. The story was already running ahead of me, but the worst part was the uncertainty. I didn't know what Richard Hall would do. He was powerful, and men like him didn't like being embarrassed. Had I crossed a line? Would I be fired? Would the gallery ban me? Erase me the way people in power always erase the poor? All day, I worked with that dread in my stomach. Every sound of footsteps behind me made me stiffen. Every time a manager called my name, I braced myself for the words I feared. "You're done here." Yet they never came. Instead, there was silence. A heavy, waiting kind of silence, like the city itself was holding its breath. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window with my old paintbrush in hand. I turned it over and over between my fingers, tracing the grooves worn into the handle. It had been my secret comfort, a relic of the life I almost had. Last night I had let the world see it. I should have felt proud, maybe even free, but instead I felt exposed, stripped, like someone had ripped the last layer of privacy from me. And then, as the city lights flickered across the wet pavement outside, I realized something else. The whispers weren't going away. They were growing, moving, reaching places I couldn't control. I didn't know it then, but those whispers were already on their way to Richard Hall's ears. And soon, he wouldn't be able to ignore them, just as I wouldn't be able to hide from him. 2 nights after the gala, I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment, staring at the unpaid bills spread like a deck of losing cards. The hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence, and the smell of fried onions from the neighbors drifted through the paper-thin walls. It was an ordinary evening in my part of Chicago, where nothing glamorous ever reached. I was rinsing my cup when I heard a sound that didn't belong here, a polished car door shutting outside. Then voices, low, firm, and unfamiliar. I frowned, wiping my hands on a towel, and peered through the blinds. At the curb, a sleek black sedan gleamed under the flickering street lamp. Standing beside it was Richard Hall. My stomach dropped. The man who had mocked me in front of 100 people was now on my street. In my world, where the sidewalks were cracked and children played basketball with a milk crate. His tailored coat looked out of place against the graffiti-stained brick. For a moment, I thought it was a hallucination. But then he turned, scanning the row of apartments until his eyes landed on mine. And he smiled. Not the arrogant smirk I remembered, but something faint, almost human. A knock came moments later, firm, measured. My heart pounded as I opened the door just enough to see him standing there, alone, hands in his pockets. "Miss Torres," he said softly, "may I come in?" Everything inside me screamed no. Men like him didn't show up in neighborhoods like mine unless they wanted something. My pride flared hot. "If you came to fire me, you could have just called." His eyes flickered, as though my words stung more than he expected. "I didn't come to fire you. I came to apologize." I let the door hang open, unsure whether to laugh or slam it shut. Apologies weren't currency I trusted, especially from the rich, but something in his tone was different from the man who mocked me. Tentatively, I stepped aside. He walked in, his gaze moving across my cramped apartment. The peeling paint, the stack of dishes, the framed photo of my mother on the wall. For the first time, he looked out of place. Not me. Him. "I can't stop thinking about your painting," he admitted, lowering himself awkwardly into a chair that creaked under his weight. "The city you showed us. It wasn't the one I sell in brochures. It was alive, raw, real. I've lived here my whole life and never seen it that way. I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. Why are you telling me this? Because I was wrong, he said simply. I treated you like a joke. But when you picked up that brush, you showed me something I didn't know I needed to see. I stayed silent, unsure how to answer. My instinct told me not to trust him. But another part of me, the part that once dreamed of studios and exhibitions, felt the truth in his words. Richard glanced at the photo of my mother. That her? He asked gently. Yes, I said, my voice catching. She raised me alone. She passed 2 years ago. He nodded slowly, his jaw tight. For a moment the room held nothing but the hum of the refrigerator. Then he said, My father killed my dream once. I wanted to paint, but he told me to build, so I built towers. Money. Power. But I never painted again. The admission hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. I don't know why I came here, he continued, almost to himself. Maybe because I saw in you what I lost, and it shook me. I looked at him then, really looked, not as the man who had humiliated me, but as someone carrying his own kind of emptiness. And for the first time, I believed he wasn't here to mock me. He was here because he was haunted. I don't need your pity, I whispered. And I'm not offering it, he replied. His gaze steadied on mine. I'm offering a chance. I didn't answer. I didn't trust it yet. But something told me this was only the beginning, that his visit would change far more than I was ready for. I didn't plan to let him in again. After that night, I thought Richard Hall would disappear back into his world of glass towers and champagne toasts. But a week later, he showed up at the gallery, not as the untouchable tycoon holding court, but as a man who asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. We sat in one of the empty studios upstairs, the air heavy with the smell of oil paint and turpentine. I felt out of place sitting across from him, like a schoolgirl dragged into the principal's office, even though technically this was neutral ground. He started first. My father was a builder, he said quietly, his eyes tracing the cracked ceiling. Brick, mortar, sweat. He came from nothing, and he swore his son wouldn't live through the same hunger. So when I told him I wanted to paint, he laughed. He called it useless. Weak. He said art doesn't put food on the table, it doesn't keep the roof from caving in. I watched him, surprised at how his voice wavered. Richard Hall, the man who made people tremble in boardrooms, looked smaller here. So I buried it, he continued. I picked up the hammer instead of the brush. I built towers he could admire, towers that proved him right. But every time I walk through this city, all I see are canvases I never touched. His words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I forgot who he was. I only saw another child who had once wanted to create, crushed under the weight of expectation. He looked at me then. When you painted that night, it wasn't just the city I saw. It was what I lost. And I hated you for it at first, because you had the courage I didn't. I swallowed, my throat tight. Courage? I said softly. You think that was courage? That was desperation. He tilted his head, waiting. I clenched my hands in my lap, trying to steady the flood rising inside me. I went to art school once. I thought it was everything. But then my mother got sick. Hospital bills piled up faster than I could paint. One semester turned into 2. And eventually, I walked away. Because she needed me more than my dream did. The silence between us was heavy, the kind that carries understanding without words. I started cleaning because it was steady, I said. Because it paid, even if it broke me a little each day. And every night I told myself the brush in my pocket was just a memory, not a promise. Until you forced me into that spotlight. Richard's gaze softened, For once, there was no arrogance, no performance, just recognition. We sat there, two very different people, bound by the same wound. Dreams abandoned, traded for survival. His for power, mine for love, both leaving scars. And in that strange, quiet moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit. I didn't hate him anymore. I resented him, yes. But I also understood him. Because part of me was him. When I stood to leave, Richard didn't stop me. He only said one thing. "It's not too late, Elena. Not for you. Not for me." I didn't answer. But those words stayed with me long after I walked out of that studio, echoing like footsteps I couldn't escape. A few days passed after that conversation in the studio. I threw myself back into work, trying to scrub away the memory of what Richard had confessed. But his words clung to me like the faint smell of turpentine that never leaves an artist's hands. It's not too late. I didn't believe him. Not really. People like me didn't get second chances. But then one evening, as I was locking up the gallery, I found him waiting by the door. No entourage, no glass of wine, no smirk. Just Richard Hall in a dark coat, standing like a man who wasn't sure he should be there. "Walk with me," he said. Every instinct told me to refuse, but something in his voice, lower, stripped of its usual command, made me nod. We walked out into the cold Chicago night, the city humming around us with taxis and neon. After a while, he spoke. "You made me remember who I was before money told me who to be, and I can't ignore that anymore." I shoved my hands in my pockets, wary. "What do you want from me, Richard?" "Not pity," he said. "Not forgiveness. I want collaboration." I almost laughed. "Collaboration? You're a billionaire developer. I'm a janitor." "Not to me," he said firmly. "To me, you're the artist who pulled a city out of rain and color in front of people who didn't believe in you. I want the world to see that too." I stopped walking, studying him under the harsh glow of a streetlight. He didn't look like the man who once mocked me. He looked tired, determined. He took a breath. "I'm starting a project, a series of community art centers tied to my properties. Not for profit. God knows I have enough. For people like you. People whose voices never reach the galleries uptown. I want you to be the artist in residence, to lead, to paint, to bring them in." The words hung in the air like something impossible. Me? The woman who cleaned floors until her knuckles cracked? The woman who still owed rent? He was asking me to step into a role I had buried years ago. "I don't belong in that world," I whispered. Richard's eyes narrowed. "And you think I do?" "I've spent decades selling space but never filling it with meaning. You belong there more than anyone I know." I looked away, heart pounding. The fear was louder than his conviction. Fear of ridicule, fear of failing, fear that I wasn't enough, that I never would be. He must have sensed it, because his voice softened. "Let me show you the studio I've set aside. Just see it. If you walk away after that, I won't stop you." I wanted to say no. I wanted to protect myself from the hope rising in my chest. But deep down, I knew I already wanted to see it. So I nodded. Just once. His face broke into something I had never seen before. Relief. Almost gratitude. We walked the rest of the block in silence, but inside me, a storm raged. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything. And though I didn't know it yet, stepping into that studio would not only reshape my life, it would force Richard to confront his own, piece by piece, until neither of us recognized the people we once were. The first time I saw the studio, I couldn't breathe. Richard had kept his promise. A week after our walk, he drove me to the south side, to a building that looked like every other abandoned warehouse in Chicago. Bricks weathered, Windows clouded with dust, graffiti crawling up the walls like ivy. I thought he was joking when he said, "This is it." But then he unlocked the rusted door and pushed it open. Inside, light poured down from tall windows I hadn't noticed from the street. The air smelled of old wood and faint paint thinner. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight, turning the space into something almost holy. Against the far wall stood rows of blank canvases, stacked like silent witnesses, waiting. My feet wouldn't move. It had been years since I'd stepped into a space like this. Years since I let myself even imagine belonging in one. Richard didn't say anything. He just set down the keys on a table scarred with old cuts and burns, then stepped aside. As though the room wasn't his to offer, it was mine to claim. I walked slowly, fingertips grazing the edges of the canvases. Each touch sent a shiver through me, a reminder of what I had lost. My chest tightened with equal parts joy and grief. In the corner, an easel held a fresh canvas taller than me. Next to it, brushes still wrapped in paper, jars of paint lined neatly like soldiers awaiting orders. For a second, I thought this was a cruel dream, some trick my mind was playing before dropping me back into the gray world of bleach and mops. But it was real. And the strangest thing was, I felt afraid. Not of failing, though that fear pulsed in me too, but of what might happen if I succeeded. What if picking up the brush again opened wounds I had managed to scar over? What if it made me hope? I reached into my pocket, pulling out the old brush I carried everywhere. Its wooden handle was worn smooth, the bristles frayed and uneven. Against the pristine tools waiting for me, it looked pathetic, out of place. But in my hand, it felt like home. "I don't deserve this," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Richard, standing by the door, finally spoke. "Neither do I. But sometimes we get what we don't deserve. And maybe that's the point." I turned, caught off guard by his honesty. His expression wasn't the mask of the tycoon. It was weary, open. He gestured to the easel. "Go on." My hand shook as I dipped the old brush into a jar of paint. The color bled rich and deep across the bristles. I pressed it to the canvas, leaving a single streak. Then another. Soon, shapes began to emerge, shaky at first, then steadier. My wrist remembered movements I thought I'd forgotten. With every stroke, the dust inside me cleared a little. My mother's voice echoed faintly, her laugh when she saw me covered in paint as a teenager, her pride when I showed her my first sketch. I felt her here, in this light, in this room. When I finally stepped back, there was no finished picture, just beginnings. A skyline forming. A street wet with rain. Not complete, not perfect, but alive. Tears blurred my vision. I wiped them quickly, ashamed. Richard didn't move closer. He simply said, "Welcome back." And in that instant, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just painting again. I was beginning to believe again. When I returned to the studio the next morning, I expected to be alone. That was part of what I loved. The silence, the echo of my brush against the canvas, the sound of my own breathing filling a space that finally felt mine. But Richard was already there. He stood awkwardly near the easel, a fresh canvas in front of him. His sleeves were rolled up, his jacket thrown carelessly across a chair. In his hand was one of the brand new brushes he'd bought for me. He held it like a man trying to write in a language he'd forgotten. When he saw me, he almost looked embarrassed. "I couldn't wait," he admitted. I raised an eyebrow. "Wait for what?" "To start again," he said, gesturing at the blank canvas. "But the truth is, I don't know where to begin." I laughed before I could stop myself. The mighty Richard Hall, who negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, was staring at a blank canvas like it might swallow him whole. He smirked faintly. Don't enjoy this too much. I set down my bag and crossed the room. You really want to learn? I want to remember, he corrected. His voice was quieter than usual, almost fragile. So I sighed, picked up a second brush, and stood beside him. Fine. First lesson. Stop gripping it like you're about to hammer a nail. You're not building a tower. You're letting something breathe. He adjusted, fumbling, his knuckles whitening. Relax your hand, I said, reaching over to guide his wrist. The contact startled me. I hadn't touched him before. His skin was warm, but the muscles in his arm were tense as steel. Slowly, I loosened his grip. There. Better. He tried a stroke. The line came out heavy, uneven. He groaned. That looks like nothing. Of course it looks like nothing, I said. It's your first mark. Do you expect a masterpiece in 5 seconds? He gave me a sharp look, then chuckled. You don't hold back, do you? Why should I? I replied. You didn't when you mocked me at the gala. That silenced him. He dipped the brush again, more carefully this time. His second line was straighter, then a third. Still clumsy, but less forced. Better, I said softly. For the next hour, I guided him. How to move from the shoulder instead of the wrist. How to let the brush glide instead of stabbing the canvas. How to breathe with the rhythm of the strokes. He listened intently. For once, not the man who commanded rooms, but a student. Every mistake frustrated him, but each correction seemed to strip away a layer of arrogance. Underneath, I saw something I hadn't expected. Eagerness, vulnerability, even joy. At one point, his brush slipped and splattered paint across his shirt. He swore under his breath, then glanced at me. I burst out laughing. It was the first time I laughed freely in months. He grinned sheepishly, dabbing at the stain, then shrugged. Guess I'll need a new wardrobe. By the end of the lesson, his canvas was messy, chaotic, a storm of lines and patches of color. But his eyes shone in a way I hadn't seen before. He stepped back, breathing hard, and looked at me. It's terrible. It's alive, I said. And I meant it. For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the smell of paint thick in the air, our canvases glowing under the fading sunlight. Two people who had buried their dreams, now unearthing them together in a dusty studio on the south side. When I left that night, Richard was still staring at his canvas, brush in hand. And I knew this was no longer just my story. It was ours. It started with whispers, the kind that slither through narrow hallways and echo in corners where you think you're alone. But whispers have a way of growing teeth. One morning, I walked into the gallery with my cleaning cart, only to feel the shift in the air. Conversation stopped when I passed. People's eyes lingered a little too long, phones lowered mid-scroll. At first, I thought it was about the painting again, about that night I accidentally tore down the curtain of invisibility. But I was wrong. Did you hear? A woman's voice floated from behind a column. Hall's got a new project. Project? Please. That janitor is his mistress. My chest went cold. The laughter that followed was sharper than bleach. I gripped the cart tighter, my knuckles white, pretending I hadn't heard. But once a rumor takes root, it grows fast. Within days, I saw my own face on the glowing screens of strangers' phones. Not smiling portraits, not professional headshots. Grainy photos snapped when I entered or left the studio with Richard. My name wasn't in the headlines. They called me the mystery woman, the cleaning lady turned muse. Some articles hinted at scandal. Others mocked me outright, from mop bucket to millionaire's lap. I stopped buying coffee at the corner shop because the barista's eyes said more than his words. I stopped taking the bus because I caught people staring, whispering behind their hands. At night, alone in my apartment, I tried to laugh it off. I told myself these people didn't know me, didn't know the bills stacked on my table, or the nights I stayed awake praying my mother's pain would ease. But it didn't matter. The story had outgrown me. What hurt most wasn't strangers. It was my own neighbors. A woman who used to wave at me across the hall now turned her face away. Children who once asked me to help fix their broken bike chains now giggled when I passed, whispering things they'd overheard their parents say. And then came the call. My aunt, one of the last pieces of family I had left. Her voice was brittle. Elena, Mija, is it true? That man. You're with him? I'm not with him, I said, my throat tight. He's helping me paint again. That's all. But even as I spoke, I heard the disbelief in her silence. Finally, she sighed. They'll never see you as an artist, Elena. Not when they've already decided who you are. After we hung up, I sat in the dark with my old paintbrush in hand. I ran my fingers along its worn handle, the way I always did when I needed to remind myself who I was. But even then, for the first time, the brush felt like it might not be enough to shield me. The city had started telling a story about me, a story that wasn't mine. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to take it back. Yet somewhere deep down, under the shame and fear, a small voice whispered, "Paint louder. Show them. Don't let gossip be the last word." I didn't believe that voice yet, but it was there, waiting. By the end of that week, the gossip had grown into something larger, louder, heavier than I could carry. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was headlines, online blogs, local papers, even business journals that never cared about art suddenly had something to say about me. They didn't call me Elena Torres, the woman who once dreamed of painting. They called me the janitor turned mistress, Hall's scandal, the distraction. I thought Richard would brush it off. Men like him had weathered worse storms, hadn't they? But one afternoon, I walked into the studio and found him pacing, phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp. "I don't care what the board thinks," he snapped. "This isn't about quarterly returns, it's about something bigger." His tone dropped, low and clipped. If they can't understand that, maybe they're not the partners I need. When he hung up, I asked quietly, "Is it bad?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Investors don't like scandals. They're threatening to pull funding from my new developments if I keep associating with you." The word stung. Associating. Like I was a bad investment. A liability stamped across my forehead. I tried to laugh, though it came out hollow. Well, maybe they're right. I never asked for any of this. Richard turned, eyes blazing. "No, Elena. They're wrong. They think they can reduce you to gossip because that's all they know. But when you painted in that gallery, you showed them something none of their money could buy. That terrified them." His conviction should have steadied me, but instead it broke something open. My voice cracked. "Don't you see? I don't want to be anyone's scandal. I didn't survive all these years cleaning floors just to become a punchline in their magazines." I picked up my old brush from the table, holding it like a talisman. This was supposed to be mine. Painting, quiet, pure. But now it feels poisoned. For a long moment he didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Then he stepped closer, softer this time. "Do you think I care what they say? Do you think their approval keeps me awake at night? It doesn't. But your silence does." Something in his voice made me look up. There was no arrogance, no control, just desperation, raw and unguarded. Still, the fear in me was louder. I shook my head. Maybe I should walk away. From you. From the studio. From all of this. Maybe it was a mistake to pick up the brush again. He went very still. For a moment I thought he might argue, but instead he exhaled slowly, as though forcing down his frustration. "If you walk away, you'll think you're protecting yourself, but you'll be killing the part of you that's still alive." His words hung heavy, like wet clothes clinging to skin. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But the image of my neighbors whispering, of my aunt's disappointed sigh, of headlines calling me a fraud, it drowned me. I don't know if I'm strong enough, I whispered. Richard studied me, then picked up one of the clean brushes from the table. He held it out, his hand steady despite everything. Then let me be strong for both of us. Don't quit now. I didn't take it. Not yet. My fingers ached too, but fear rooted me to the floor. And that's how we stayed. Two people in a half-lit studio, one offering a brush, the other too afraid to take it. But deep down, even in my silence, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the storm before whatever came next. I thought the storm of rumors would push Richard away. Any reasonable man with an empire to protect would have cut his losses, quietly distanced himself from the janitor who became his scandal. But instead, he showed up at the studio one gray afternoon carrying a folder under his arm, his face flushed from the cold and from something else. Determination. He laid the folder on the table and slid it toward me. Inside were sketches, building plans, and notes scrawled in his heavy handwriting. At the top, in bold letters, was one word: exhibition. I frowned, flipping through the pages. They weren't about new apartments or offices. They were about an open space in the heart of the city. A community hall, bright and welcoming, designed for art. On one page was even a mock flyer: Voices of the City, an exhibition of ordinary lives, and beneath it, in smaller print, my name. I froze. What is this? Richard leaned on the edge of the table, watching me carefully. It's your show. Our show, if you'll allow it. A place where your work isn't hidden in a studio or drowned in gossip, where the city can see you for who you really are. My stomach turned. The very thought made me dizzy. I shook my head. Number, I can't. I'm not ready for that. He didn't flinch. You were ready the night you painted in that gallery. You think people were laughing, but Elena, they weren't. They were silent because you shook them. I pushed the folder back across the table. That was an accident, a moment. If I try again and fail, that silence will turn to ridicule, and I don't think I could survive that twice. He studied me, his expression softening. Do you remember the first time you picked up a brush? Not at the gala. Years ago. What did it feel like? The memory rose uninvited. Me as a child, sitting on the kitchen floor with cheap watercolors, painting the cracked linoleum tiles into rivers and skies. My mother standing over me, smiling despite the exhaustion etched into her face. Her hand on my shoulder as she whispered, "Keep going, mija." It made my chest ache. I was a kid, I muttered. I didn't know better. No, Richard said firmly. You knew exactly what mattered. You just forgot. Let me help you remember. I looked at him, at the folder still open between us, at my name printed where it had no right to be. Every part of me wanted to slam it shut, to protect myself from the raw hope clawing at my chest. But another part, quiet, stubborn, the same part that kept an old brush in my pocket for years, wanted to believe him. I turned away, walking to the window. Outside, the city pulsed with life, buses groaning, children shouting, lights flickering on in the early dusk. Chicago didn't care who I was, but maybe it could see me if I dared to show it. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. An exhibition, I whispered. Do you have any idea how terrifying that sounds? Behind me, Richard's voice was steady. Yes. And that's why it's worth doing. Once I agreed, if you could call my hesitant nod an agreement, there was no turning back. Richard threw himself into the logistics of the exhibition with the same ferocity he probably used to close billion-dollar deals, permits, sponsors, venues. Every day he arrived at the studio with updates, calls, deadlines. And me? I buried myself in paint. The studio became my world. Morning bled into night. Days vanished in the haze of turpentine and color. I painted until my wrists ached, until my fingers cramped, until my eyes burned from staring too long at lines that never seemed good enough. I chased the rain. That was the theme I kept coming back to. Chicago in the rain. Because rain was honest. It revealed the city's cracks and softened its edges. It turned neon signs into rivers of color, turned strangers into silhouettes under umbrellas, turned broken sidewalks into mirrors. It was beauty and pain, survival and surrender. Just like me. But every stroke carried doubt. What if my work wasn't enough? What if the whispers out there were right? That I was just a janitor pretending to be an artist? Some nights I would collapse onto the studio floor, staring up at the beams overhead, too exhausted to move. I'd hold the old brush against my chest like a prayer. Richard tried to help in his own way. He'd drop by between meetings, loosen his tie, and sit quietly in the corner while I painted. Sometimes he'd pick up a brush himself, practicing clumsy strokes on a spare canvas. Watching him struggle made me laugh, and for a few minutes the fear loosened its grip. But outside our four walls, the pressure was mounting. Critics began to circle like vultures. Articles appeared questioning Richard's judgment, accusing him of turning philanthropy into spectacle. One columnist sneered, "Elevating a janitor to the stage won't clean the stain on his reputation." I pretended not to read them, but of course I did. Each word felt like a bruise. One evening, I found Richard in the studio long after he should have been gone. He sat hunched over, a glass of scotch untouched beside him, the glow of his phone casting shadows across his face. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp. "They're threatening to pull the venue," he muttered when he saw me. "Too much controversy. Too much risk." My heart sank. "So, that's it? It's over before it even begins?" He looked up at me, and for once I saw not the tycoon, not the billionaire, but the boy he must have been. The boy who once dreamed of painting. "No," he said firmly. "I won't let them take this from you. From us." The word us lingered in the air, heavier than paint fumes. I sat across from him, pulling the old brush from my pocket. I turned it between my fingers, the bristles worn almost flat now. "This brush. It's the only thing I kept when I gave up painting. I thought it was just a memory. But maybe it was a promise." His gaze softened. "A promise to who?" I swallowed. "To myself. To my mother. To the girl I used to be." Richard leaned forward, his voice quiet but steady. "Then let's keep that promise, no matter what they say." And for the first time, I believed him. The days that followed were brutal. I painted until my hands blistered, until the walls of the studio were covered in rain-soaked skylines, alleys shimmering with reflections, faces blurred beneath umbrellas. Each canvas was a piece of me I hadn't shown the world in years. And every night, when exhaustion threatened to crush me, I reminded myself of the promise that when the exhibition doors opened, they wouldn't just see a janitor, they'd see Elena Torres. A week before the exhibition, when the canvases were finally lining the studio walls like a chorus of voices, the past came knocking. Not politely. It barged in. It started with a phone call. My old classmate from art school, Maya. We hadn't spoken in years. She was the one who stayed when I dropped out to care for my mother, the one who chased the dream I abandoned. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Elena," she said, her tone clipped. I see you found your way back into the spotlight. Her words weren't congratulations. They were daggers wrapped in silk. It's not like that, I muttered. It just happened. Oh, it happened, did it? Her laugh was sharp. Funny how some of us struggle for decades, and you, what? Mop a few floors and suddenly you're Richard Hall's muse? The venom in her voice made my chest ache. Once, we'd sat shoulder to shoulder in cramped studios, sharing sandwiches when neither of us could afford lunch. Now her voice felt like a stranger's. I didn't ask for this, I whispered. Maybe not. But you're taking it, aren't you? She snapped. And I won't let you steal the stage from people who actually paid their dues. She hung up before I could respond. That night, the sabotage began. The next morning, blogs buzzed with news stories. Not about Richard, not about gossip, but about me. Anonymous posts claiming I had stolen my work from classmates, that I had never shown talent in school, that I was using Richard's wealth to prop myself up as something I wasn't. Screenshots of old, half-finished sketches I'd abandoned in college were circulated as proof of my mediocrity. Each headline cut deeper: the janitor fraud, the myth of Elena Torres, manufactured talent. I wanted to scream, to fight back. But how? The internet didn't care about truth. It cared about spectacle. And Maya knew exactly which wounds to reopen. When Richard found me in the studio, I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by my canvases, unable to even look at them. They think I'm a fraud, I said hoarsely. Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here. He crouched down, forcing me to meet his eyes. Listen to me. You're not a fraud. I've seen you paint. I've felt what your work does. No headline can erase that. But the exhibition will happen, he interrupted. His voice was steel. And when those doors open, they'll see the truth with their own eyes. Not in words, not in gossip, in color, in rain, in you. I wanted to believe him, but Maya's words lingered like a poison. You didn't earn this. That night, as I locked up the studio, I held my old brush tighter than ever. My mother's voice came back to me, faint but steady. Keep going, Mija. Maybe the world would call me a fraud. Maybe Maya would never forgive me for standing where she thought she should be. But I knew one thing. If I quit now, they'd be right. And I couldn't let them win. 2 nights before the exhibition, I broke. The studio that once felt like sanctuary had turned into a cage. My canvases, lined neatly against the walls, didn't look like art anymore. They looked like accusations. Evidence of a lie I was too afraid to confess. The headlines had seeped into me, poisoned my vision. Fraud, imposter, janitor with a rich man's brush. I stayed late that night, painting furiously, as if more strokes could drown out the noise. But every line came out wrong, too harsh, too clumsy. I tore the canvas from the easel, shoved it aside, started another. That one failed, too. Soon the floor was littered with discarded work, half-finished streets smeared into nothing. My chest tightened. My throat burned. I dropped the brush and pressed my palms into my eyes until I saw stars. I can't do this, I whispered into the emptiness. I don't belong here. The silence didn't answer back. I slid to the floor, knees pulled tight against me. My old brush slipped from my pocket, clattering onto the concrete. I stared at it through tears. That little piece of wood had been my anchor, my secret hope. Now it mocked me. I picked it up and hurled it across the room. The sound echoed sharp and final. And then, in that hollow moment, a memory rose, clearer than the walls around me. I was 15 again, sitting at the kitchen table with my mother. She was tired from her shift at the diner, her apron still stained. But she watched me sketch with the kind of focus that made the world feel safe. I had thrown my pencil down in frustration. It's terrible. I'll never be good enough. She reached across, lifting my chin so I couldn't look away. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, held me. Mija, art isn't about being good enough. It's about telling the truth no one else can see. And you, she tapped my chest, you carry truths no one else does. The memory cracked something inside me. Tears spilled hot and relentless. For the first time in years, I let myself cry like a child, grieving not just the rumors, not just the exhibition, but the absence of the only voice that ever believed in me without question. I whispered into the dark, "Mama, I don't know if I can do this without you." But somehow, in the stillness, I felt her answer. Not in words, but in the weight of that memory, the way her hand had steadied mine, the way her voice carried certainty even when life gave her none. Slowly, I crawled across the floor, searching until my fingers brushed against the old paintbrush where it had fallen. The bristles were bent, the handle cracked. It was broken. But so was I. And maybe that was enough. I held it to my chest, rocking gently, breathing deep until the panic loosened its grip. I wasn't fixed. Not yet. But I wasn't finished either. By dawn, when Richard arrived and found me curled on the floor, canvases scattered like wreckage, I didn't try to hide my tears. He crouched beside me, his voice quiet. "Elena." I shook my head, clutching the brush. I almost quit. He didn't lecture me, didn't scold. He just placed his hand over mine, grounding me. "Then don't quit tomorrow." Something about the way he said it, firm, simple, kept me tethered. I wasn't ready to face the world yet, but for the first time in days, I believed maybe I could. The night of the exhibition, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The community hall Richard had transformed was glowing with light. Outside, cars lined the street. Photographers lingered like vultures, and strangers pressed forward, eager to see the spectacle the city had been whispering about for weeks. Some came for the art. Most came for the scandal. Inside, my paintings filled the walls. The rain-soaked streets, the reflections, the silhouettes. Pieces of me I had never shown anyone now stood exposed under bright lights. They felt like pages from a diary someone had torn open. I stood at the edge of the room, hidden behind a column, clutching my old brush in my pocket as though it could protect me. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted the canvases to speak for me. But the problem was, tonight, people wanted me. Richard appeared at my side. His suit was sharp, but his eyes were softer than I'd ever seen them. "You ready?" he asked. I forced a laugh. "Not even close." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Then let them see that. Let them see the truth. That's what your art is, Elena." Before I could answer, the crowd hushed. A spotlight snapped on, illuminating the podium at the front of the hall. Richard stepped forward, commanding the room as easily as he always had. He spoke of the city, of community, of voices too often ignored. And then he turned toward me. "Elena Torres," he said, his voice steady, "is one of those voices. Tonight, she paints for all of us." Applause thundered. My heart lurched. Suddenly, all eyes turned. I wanted to run, but instead I felt my mother's voice echo in my chest. "You carry truths no one else does." So I stepped out from behind the column. My knees wobbled, but I walked, one step after another until I stood in front of them all. The room blurred, faces melting into a sea of expectation. I reached for the brush in my pocket, holding it tight. Then I lifted my gaze toward the nearest canvas. One of my favorites. A narrow alley shimmering with rain, a single lamplight glowing like hope. "This is my Chicago," I said quietly, my voice barely carrying. Not the skyline on postcards, not the towers in brochures. This is the city I walked when my shoes were soaked and my pockets were empty. This is the city that raised me. The silence was thick. Then someone clapped. Then another. Soon the hall filled with sound, not polite applause, not forced, but real. I felt tears sting my eyes. Richard caught my gaze across the room, giving a small nod, and in that moment, I understood. The gossip, the headlines, the doubt. They weren't gone. They might never be gone. But tonight, they didn't matter. Because tonight, my truth was louder. When the applause finally died down, the night unfolded like a dream I had never dared to imagine. People didn't just glance at my paintings as they sipped their wine. They stopped. They lingered. Some leaned in close to trace the brush strokes with their eyes, as if searching for pieces of themselves hidden in the rain-soaked alleys and glowing windows I had painted. I stood quietly at the edge, watching, no longer hiding, but not quite believing, either. A woman with silver hair touched my arm gently. "That one," she whispered, pointing to a canvas of a bus stop under storm clouds. "That was me. I swear it was me." Her eyes glistened. I didn't know what to say except, it was all of us. Another man, rough around the edges, confessed that he'd grown up on the same streets I painted. "Nobody paints our corners," he said. "But you did." Each word chipped away at the doubt that had built a fortress inside me. For years, I thought invisibility was safety. But here I was, visible at last. And instead of arrows, I was met with recognition. Even the critics came, though their notebooks were shields. One of them, a man who had mocked me in print weeks earlier, stood staring at a canvas longer than he probably realized. His pen hovered, then lowered. He didn't approach me, but when he left, I noticed his expression had softened, like a man caught off guard by something he couldn't dismiss. Across the room, Richard moved through the crowd with his usual authority, but his eyes kept finding mine. Each time they did, he gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "See? I told you." At one point, he slipped away from the conversations and joined me near a painting of the skyline reflected in puddles. "They're seeing you now," he said quietly. "They're seeing the city," I corrected, though my voice trembled. He studied me for a long moment. "Maybe they're the same thing." I didn't know how to answer. Instead, I held up the old brush I still kept in my pocket, the handle worn smooth, the bristles crooked. This was all I had left of my dream, and now it feels like it brought me here. Richard's gaze softened. "It didn't bring you here. You did." The night stretched on, filled with conversations, handshakes, and voices that blurred together. But underneath it all was a current I couldn't ignore. Something in me had shifted. By the time the hall emptied and the lights dimmed, I stood alone in front of my favorite canvas, the alley glowing under rain, the lamplight burning steady. My reflection shimmered faintly in the varnish. For the first time, I didn't see a cleaner pretending to be an artist. I saw an artist who had once been invisible, now standing in the open. The city hadn't changed. The critics hadn't all been silenced. Gossip still lingered somewhere out there, waiting. But inside me, the transformation was undeniable. I thought of my mother, of her tired hands resting on my shoulder, of her voice telling me to keep going. I wished she could have seen this night, but in a way, I knew she had. Every stroke carried her. Every truth I painted was a conversation we were still having. When I finally left the hall, the streets of Chicago were wet from a fresh rain. Puddles caught the glow of the street lamps, reflections shimmering like the paintings behind me. I walked slowly, the old brush tucked safe in my pocket, no longer a relic but a reminder. I wasn't the janitor who faded into the background anymore. I wasn't the scandal or the whisper or the fraud. I was Elena Torres, an artist, and the city, at last, knew my name.